Right, a very warm welcome everybody this morning to yet another Wednesday webinar. Hopefully the weather's significantly better than it is down here in rainy, drizzly, windy Farnham. We've got a great topic for you today, and I'll be introducing Fionn shortly. But just by way of a bit of etiquette, do please keep your mics on mute to cut down any background noise and make sure the experience for everybody else on the call is as good as it can be. We are recording this webinar as usual, and this is going to go up on YouTube by the end of the day, as well as the presentation that Fionn's going to be doing for us will be sharing in full as well. With just a quick mention there about YouTube, if you guys want to keep up to date with the videos that we are putting up on YouTube, we've got a massive amount of content on there. Do feel free to subscribe to the channel as well, and obviously you'll get notifications when when new material goes up there, and we're going to be putting our foot down and putting more and more material on there as the year goes on. So just a couple of quick pieces from me, but as I say, before we get on to the main speaker today, if you are new to our webinars here at Mesh Energy or don't know anything about Mesh Energy and have just heard about our great Wednesday webinars, I'm just going to spend 30 seconds just talking to you about what we are and what we do. Fundamentally, we are independent and holistic energy consultants. We partner with architects and other design professionals really to try and make sustainable projects as successful as possible, and ideally, if you're brand new to sustainability or sustainable building design, we can give you that experience that you need to make sure you knock it out of the park, regardless of what type of building you're doing and what size. Best to get us involved at the earliest stages of your projects, but we can do a number of bespoke things to help you out regardless of where you are on your project. So enough about that. Do visit the website if you want to find out more details. And a quick reminder here, we've mentioned this before about our Meshwork platform. Some of you lucky ducks will have got an invite out today. There's going to be another 100 people who are getting an invite to join the Meshwork, which is this education platform that we're launching. If you get that invite, do check it out. There's a 30-day free trial there. And there's a whole load of great information being put up there on a daily basis, and more engagement as the days go on. If you've been on these webinars before, certainly prior to March, you'll be getting an invite by the end of the month. And then in April, we're going to be launching to everybody else, and you can invite who you like. So do register your interest and make sure you're one of the first to be invited in the coming weeks. But as I say, if you've been on the webinars, then you'll have an invite in your inbox in the next couple of weeks at the very latest. So enough about that. Without further ado, I am going to introduce Professor Fionn Stevenson. She's the Professor of Sustainable Design at Sheffield Uni, which is a School of Architecture. And also worthy of note here is for the Building Performance Network, she's the campaigns director. No doubt Fionn will tell us a bit more about that as the talk goes on. But enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Fionn, and she's going to be talking about post-occupancy evaluation. So Fionn, if you want to just quickly share your screen, and then I will leave it to you.
Thanks very much, Doug. That's great. So I hope everyone can see the screen. And just for the next half hour or so, I'm going to talk to you about post-occupancy evaluation and why it's so important. I was an architect for 8 years. I've been an academic researcher and consultant for nearly 30 years now. And my background is that I developed sustainable housing design, and I then followed that up with developing policy, which looked at sustainable resource use, looking at low impact materials, design for deconstruction. And then I moved into post-occupancy evaluation. And I've been advising the UK government, MHCLG, BEES, RIBA and various other bodies on how to mainstream this. There's a gap in the market, so I published this book which tells you how to do it, and it's online as well. And really, to set the background, the challenge is that we've got 29 million homes that are not fit for purpose and that we need to upgrade. And we're also trying to build a whole bunch of new homes very rapidly. And of course, these need to aim for zero carbon. This is the sort of typical drawing that we as architects start out with, the dream home, this one by Terry Farrell. But unfortunately, design intentions very often don't get met in reality. Here we've got three quick images, one of on the left of residents desperately trying to create cross ventilation to cool their home using the traditional chair to wedge the door. Top right hand side, we've got a very filthy MVHR filter that not only the residents were aware of, but also the housing association wasn't aware of it either. Bottom right is good old fashioned plumbing. And unfortunately, we still see instances where plumbing is not properly insulated. The bigger picture, we had 4.5 million homes, 4.5 million overheating in 2018. That's only set to increase. We also have about 5.5 million people suffering from asthma, and that is increasingly being related to issues in the home, whether it's toxic materials or simply mold from poor design. So our homes are underperforming, and we regularly see homes using 2 to 3 times the amount of energy that they're supposed to be using. And that isn't just down to the occupants, it is often down to design and construction issues. So why is this happening? Well, basically, our design intentions are only as good as what we already know. There's no legal requirement to provide feedback from reality once we build our buildings. And so, quite honestly, we don't know what's going on. And that's why I love this cartoon by Hellman, which shows the whole design team flying blind because we don't get feedback. And we don't even teach our students how to get feedback from buildings. So why is it a great thing to do post-occupancy evaluation, or the wider aspect of building performance evaluation, which means looking at the whole building cycle? Well, there are 7 reasons. Basically, if we do POE as part of a wider building performance evaluation cycle, we can improve our products, our design, and we can improve the design process. We reduce risks and hidden liabilities by exposing them early on. We reduce defects by understanding them through looking at them. We reduce maintenance, again, by understanding what really happens once our buildings get rained on. We can future-proof our buildings by understanding how they're behaving in reality. And all of this will lead to improved customer satisfaction, a better reputation for us as designers. And what does that mean? Repeat business. So 4 quick questions when we're doing POE. These are the basic 4 questions everyone needs to have in their head. Is the home performing as it should be? Are people happy in their home? Are there any immediate problems? And how can we improve design and homes for the future? We basically need to do this also to validate the very design modeling tools that we're using. Modeling tools are only as good as the feedback given to them, which is why most modeling tools are not particularly accurate. So when we're doing our performance evaluation for real, this is a key slide. We need to compare the design intentions to reality. That means looking at the original specifications and drawings and understanding any changes that happened. We need to look at a bunch of hard data, physical comfort factors, possibly pollution levels, certainly looking at the fabric performance, the energy use and the water use. Then we need to look at the essential soft data that often gets left out of monitoring. And this is not just a customer satisfaction survey. This is about looking at people's needs and their capacities to use the buildings we design for them. And that's a different way of thinking about post-occupancy evaluation, not satisfaction, but whether the buildings we've designed are designed for the capabilities that people have. And that's particularly around control and learning of the equipment that we put into the homes. We then compare the hard and soft data with the original design intentions to revise and improve our design, and also to future-proof them. Now, if you want to do this, you need to build in POE from the very beginning. Don't start thinking about it whilst you're designing. It's too late. It needs to go in at the beginning with the client at the briefing stage, at the feasibility stage. Otherwise, it becomes expensive. The other thing is POE can be cheap, very cheap. To do a light touch POE may be as little as £5,000 for a housing development, possibly 10. And once you've done that, if the home is performing as expected, you don't need to do anything else. You don't need to bean count. You don't need to do monitoring for the sake of monitoring. But if there are issues, you need to move down to the next level. Then you need to start diagnosing the issues that are thrown up by the light touch POE, and that is more expensive. And finally, for the most stubborn problems, you need to use forensic methods. But the key takeaway from this slide is you should be looking for exceptions, looking for things that stand out as not normal, not monitoring for normality. So I'm going to introduce you to 6 initial actions that you can do very easily on any design project to get you going with POE. The first is to look at what the documents were, the original design documents and the specifications, and check those against the as-built. The next is a very basic energy water use audit. And you can get this either from smart metering, or if you're dealing with old homes, you can get it from the bills. The next is to do a thermographic survey. That does need some expertise, but just looking at one typical home inside and out can give you a wealth of data. Once you've done these, and these are in order, don't do them out of order. The order is logical. Once you understand the documents, the energy and water, and the thermographic survey, then it's time to ask the inhabitants what's going on. Quick survey, I'd recommend the bus questionnaire or the equivalent. And once you've done those and you have some understanding of what's going on, then it's time to do a quick walk around with the design team, armed with the information that you have from the first 4 methods, and to discuss what's going on. That will give you a much more valuable short tour. And finally, whilst you're doing the tour, you can do some quick spot checks. You can check the temperature, the light, the sound, and the humidity in the building on the spot and compare it to what the occupants are saying. Now, I hope everyone listening to this has got one of these, a thermographic imaging camera in the office. And if you haven't, go and get one now. This is the equivalent of a doctor's stethoscope. And you really need one of these to understand what's going on with your buildings. You can see here in this image that the house looks like the fabric's behaving okay. But then, of course, when we get to the basement level, hey ho, the insulation's been missed out. These X-ray specs are essential. You can do it via the phone. There are very simple devices now that you can attach to your phone for £200 or £300. Pop this in your pocket, take it out on site and use it. It's criminal that we're not using these already. You can also invest in one of these, which is a simple 4-in-1 meter, not particularly accurate, but it does give you on the spot ballpark readings. If the occupants are saying that it's too hot in the home, it can be well worthwhile doing a few spot checks on a home tour to see whether that's actually being borne out, equally with the humidity or the noise levels. So I'm going to just spend a few minutes now taking you through a case study to show you POE in action and making a difference. So this was a study we did a few years ago in the north of England, a very well-known architecture practice I'm not going to name. We're looking at a 1960s block here, of which there are many that need significant retrofit. This was a deep retrofit done. We went in to do a light touch POE, which we then needed to follow up with a diagnostic POE to understand what was happening. The big issues that came out with this particular project were overheating, the fact that the architect had turned a perfectly good plan with cross ventilation, a generous housing plan, into a single aspect plan. And a single aspect plan, believe me, I know they're sexy at the moment, but they are time bombs in terms of ventilation strategies. Please avoid single aspect. I'll show you the reason why. This is what we discovered. Here is the single aspect plan. And once we'd got the questionnaire back from the residents, we did the walkthrough. We'd also looked at the drawings, and we worked out very quickly that there's what we call a ventilation bypass. So what was happening here was there were no trickle vents. Any glazing that was developed could only be opened 100 millimeters. That's really small. And the drop-down draft excluders were not allowing, there was a conflict between fire eggs and the need for ventilation. So basically we had a pressure cooker here, where the mechanical ventilation was extracting from the front door through the cooker, out through the block, and none of the rooms were getting decent air. So we had to go in depth, and that meant we had to start measuring airflows. And we then were able to forensically diagnose that, in fact, the mechanical ventilation system installation was appalling. There were meters and meters of flexible ducting, which of course should be minimized for any MVHR installation. The commissioning was incorrect, so the flow levels had not been properly calibrated. I mean, basically, it was just a disaster. And we then looked at the energy use, and normally people say, well, you know, the energy use is due to what the occupants are doing, and that can often be true. However, the energy use was consistently over what had been predicted. And, you know, reasons for that excessive energy use were people were beginning to bring in their own devices to do their own cooling, because the design fault was that the buildings were overheating. So we did some thermal imaging, and one of the interesting things we found immediately was a stack effect. This is called stratification. You'll get this a lot, not only in blocks of housing, but also within the home. Key law of building physics is that heat rises and cold will drop in to replace it. So here we have a stack effect within the core, the stair core of the building. And of course, that heat then diffuses into the flats. So basically, if you lived in the top flats, you were getting cheaper heating in the winter. And of course, the ground floor was a lot cooler, and that was performing as designed. But the top floors were a lot warmer in the winter and really difficult to cool in the summer. So we asked the residents what they thought, and it looked from the bus questionnaire, this is a quick overview of the different questions that are asked of the occupants, and it looked from the bus survey, you know, having asked all 200 residents what they thought, that, you know, basically this looked okay. The amber shows that it was within the benchmarks, and the bus survey has thousands of studies now from offices, and hundreds and hundreds from housing developments. So they're very good, robust benchmarks. And we could see here that in terms of health and lighting, the homes were doing well, and they seem to be doing okay on comfort as well. However, when you dig into the detail, it's a well-known psychological fact that if you ask someone generally how they're doing, they'll say, fine. And if you then drill down into some detail and ask them more specific questions, they will often say, not fine. So someone will say, fine, if you ask them how they're doing. And then if you ask them, how are your feet today? They may well say, well, actually, I did twist my ankle last week, but, you know, it's healing up okay. And exactly the same happens with buildings. So people say they're generally happy with the building. There's a big forgiveness factor, maybe because it's a sexy looking design, and actually they will compensate for the fact that it's not performing because it looks good. But as you can see here, massive issues. Severe overheating in the summer and severe cold in the winter. And there are the red dots. So it's important with POE that you do dig in and just don't accept things at face value. Now, why was this happening? When we started doing the forensic monitoring, not just the spot checks, but now looking at more detail, we found that the Western single aspect homes were just set up to cook. Huge windows, no shading, looked very good. And facing the west. So, of course, what was happening was massive warm up. West-facing windows, large windows are probably the worst in the summer because the house is already warm when the sun continues to shine in the afternoon and the evening. So we were getting regular 35 degrees inside when the temperature outside was a lot cooler. And what we did was we diagnosed further, and we discovered, as you can do with POE, that there were other bigger issues. And here we have an external environment issue, which was the block was designed and renovated whilst the existing car park was not, and that's black. And basically you have a great big black heater there throwing heat into those western facing apartments. So again, really set up to cook. Now that's a case study of a retrofit. All of these issues are also happening in new builds. We have seen a number of passive house homes overheating. It's often underreported, I have to say. Sometimes the passive house crew can be a bit zealous. But you know, there have been overheating issues with passive house, and we need to pay attention to that. It's easy to avoid if it's well designed, but it does mean thinking about introducing shading ideas like this. You can add balconies, or you can add other shading, or just being really careful with the design. And a lot of new build issues are to do with usability of technology. That's a real problem. Often the occupants and the architects, who don't fully understand the technology either, are hapless. And in this case, bottom right-hand corner, we see that the controls and the meters for the solar system are in the attic. So every time you want to check out what's going on with the solar system here, you have to go into the attic. And there you can see some of that wonderful flexible ducting coming out of the mechanical ventilation system there. Again, something to avoid. And you can also see a lack of insulation on all the pipework. So other great things about POE is you can actually use it to validate your design intentions. So if you're dealing with retrofit situations, this is an Oxford study by Professor Rajat Gupta from Oxford Brookes University. And here he actually interviewed the occupants and audited the energy before even doing the POE. So he established benchmarks, reality benchmarks, before the retrofit was done. He also asked the occupants what their real needs were, and he built that into the POE design, which gave a fantastic result at the end, a finely tuned POE that actually really paid attention to the residents. So we can use BP and POE to improve design. We can roll our findings on through BIM, through workshops. People like architects have done this for years. We can also empower the inhabitants we work with, particularly for new housing models, co-housing, cooperatives, build to rent, social housing, all offer opportunities to actually work with the incoming inhabitants to develop the post-occupancy evaluation process they're going to be part of. And that actually gets you buy-in from the very people that you want to buy into the study that you're going to do. And all of this leads to a fantastic organizational learning cycle where we get occupants feedback, performance feedback from the building, going right back to the beginning of the building life cycle. And we develop what I call the organizational smile, better buildings. The good news is that beyond the book that I wrote a couple of years now, more building performance evaluation guidance is developing all the time. And just a short time ago, a fantastic organization called Wood Knowledge Wales developed this building performance evaluation guide, which is free online, and it's very detailed. It has a detailed technical guidance with a toolkit which has guidance sheets for each of the POE methods it's advocating. It's aimed at housing, but frankly, you could use it for most building types, and probably as the first port of call. Doing myself out of my book, I would send you there first. What I would say, however, is the book has a lot more background information and know-how about how to actually do a study, how to work with your clients, how to work with your occupants. The technical guide here is very good on how to work with the technical methods. So I would say they work well as a pair. The book itself not only covers case studies and how to do it, but also importantly, it's visioning in terms of looking at challenges for the future that your practice should be aware of. And it also gives you very detailed background in terms of where POE comes from, so that you don't reinvent the wheel, so that you're aware of the history of POE. They both offers two slightly different approaches to POE. So I set out to produce a book which would encourage people to dip their toe into the POE process and to work from a light touch basis down to a more diagnostic basis and then a forensic basis. Basically, the book is a campaign tool to reach out to clients, to reach out to the design team and say, have a go, and hence the 6 methods. The Wood Knowledge Wales guidance, for which I was an advisor on, has gone for more depth, and it includes all of the above, those core methods, but it also adds in a handover review, the GHA, Good Homes Alliance, overheating method. It also builds in an energy strategy review, a recheck of the air tightness, a recheck of the commissioning, and a double check of the acoustics. So it is more intense, more expensive, but very thorough. I would still argue that you could start off with the initial light touch and move on to the other stages if necessary. So I finally want to introduce you to the Building Performance Network UK, which I'm the campaign director for. And this is a national organisation. It's one of a group of organisations working under the Sustainable Development Foundation. So others you may have heard of include the Good Homes Alliance, the Association for Sustainable Building Products, and the BPN is part of that family of organisations that are working to improve design. And my role in this organisation is to encourage you to join it, to become a part of this network. We've already carried out a State of the Nation review on the performance of homes, which is accessible on the site. But we're really looking for people from Meshworks and beyond to collaborate with us, to collaborate with Meshworks, to share our data, to create data sharing platform. We're looking to create a portal, not necessarily to host the data, but we'd like to be the go-to place for building performance evaluation. So I'd welcome you to have a look at that. So just to bring the talk to its conclusion, you know, in terms of thinking about post-occupancy evaluation, or as people sometimes prefer to call it, occupancy evaluation, with post-occupancy being a bit of a misnomer, it's really now or never. We've got the new Future Homes Standard consultation on the table again from the government. And once again, the government is failing us because occupancy evaluation is not there. It's not in the building regulations. So frankly, it's up to each one of us to do it. Because even though it's not in the regulations and it's not a regulatory requirement, we are looking at a building catastrophe at the moment in terms of the climate emergency. We have 30 million homes not performing. We know that if we're going to get retrofit right and new build right, we have to do the occupancy evaluation. Otherwise, we're flying blind. We cannot rely on design modeling. We need design modeling that's informed by feedback in reality. And frankly, if we're not doing that in our practices, then shame on us, because we're failing in our ethics as professionals, because as professionals, we have a duty of care to our clients. And that duty of care means that we have to tell our clients what's really going on in their buildings. So what I'd recommend you all do as a takeaway, as one takeaway from this presentation, is start doing that post-occupancy evaluation now. Even if you start with as little as the 6 simple steps that I've recommended, do it now on one building, on one of your buildings, no matter how small it is. Do it now, do it rigorously, see what you get out of it, try it. And I guarantee that you'll never look back. You'll start to build in a virtuous learning cycle where the POE will start to save you money, not only in terms of getting repeat business, but in terms of all the thousands of hours that get wasted on having to deal with latent defects, problems that arise later in the defects period when they could have been sorted easily at the commissioning stage. So we have the housing models, we have all the technology and guidance we need already. Don't let anybody tell you we don't. We have less than 10 years now to close the performance gap in terms of making sure that our buildings are reaching zero carbon. We have everything we need, but we're just not doing it. So I really hope from this performance evaluation presentation that it's given you some insights into what you can get out of it, how to do it. And I'm very happy to take any questions either about the presentation or more generally about occupancy evaluation. Thank you very much, and look forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks, Fionn. That was really, really interesting. There's so many bits to that presentation that we could discuss about, and I think it's we've got some great questions as well, which we'll go from. The thing that particularly sticks with me is the cost uplift, and if we start just doing something, even at a very, very low cost, can be massively enlightening. You know, you don't have to spend thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds to to get to the bottom of some of these fundamentals. It can actually be done just by asking some simple questions, say by way of a questionnaire, or looking at energy bills, or really light touch stuff. So what we have got some questions here. So I punched up a couple of questions. I know Charles and Rachel have asked some great questions. Let me start with Charles's actually. I think he dropped it in before you were talking about cost, but Charles said, isn't the current problem that POE has a cost attached to it and no sponsor, which is an interesting angle. So nobody's owning POE at the moment. It's this kind of floating thing that people see the benefits for, hopefully see the benefits for, but there's nobody actually responsible for delivering it. So the question is, who should bear the cost, and who should own POE?
Yeah, it's interesting. I get this question on every presentation. I mean, first of all, I want to bust the myth about the cost. So there's actually a very good new book out by Sophie Pelsmacher, Judith Kimpion. I'm just looking at it on my shelf, and it's called.
Is it this one? That one?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah,
you've probably got the background, but it's in the RIBA bookstore, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's Energy, People and Buildings. Yes. Energy, People and Buildings. Fantastic book. Now, if you read that book, because I covered housing, they're actually covering non-domestic mainly. So it's a great pairing. And I was actually one of the reviewers for that book as well. And I would urge every practice to buy that book. It's brilliant. It works with a risk register, and it's all about de-risking your buildings. POE is de-risking. But the crucial thing in it about cost is that they'll argue for non-domestic projects that actually the cost uplift, providing you build it in from the beginning, is as little as 0.25% or even 0.025%. In other words, it's a really minor cost uplift. The major cost issues that happen with POE is when the design team don't plan it in from the beginning properly and don't take advantage of the automatic monitoring that you can do by building in the right type of sensors, the right smart meters, the right water meters. And also don't take advantage of all the streamlining you can do to make POE really, really cheap. So for example, automated occupant questionnaire analysis, building in thermography as a routine part of the contract, making it a part of the contract. So I think, a lot of these cost issues can be bottomed out by thinking ahead, putting the ownership in through the contract conditions. In terms of whether it's the client or the architect, I would always argue that the eventual costs come back to the client. The client is procuring the building. The client will ultimately end up paying for the POE, because even if the architects do it, that's a service that they're offering, and that service is part of their fee. So it should be part of the fee, and the fee should include POE, and that fee cost goes back to the client. So your job as architects is to tell your clients that POE is part of your fee. Now, back in 1965, there was a Part M to the RIBA plan of works, sorry, RIBA plan of works, and Part M was post-occupancy evaluation. So back in the 60s, this is why I think it's good in my chapter on the history of POE to understand the history of POE. Back in the 60s, POE was professionally mandatory, but it was dropped. Yeah, it was dropped as a mandatory requirement because it wasn't regulated. So the final arbiter on any kind of building activity is building regulations. And that's why, as a campaigns director, I am campaigning to get the building regulations changed, which is why I would like everyone on this call to do one other thing apart from persuading your clients that your fee includes POE. And that is to answer the current government consultation on Part L related to the Future Home Standard and related to the non-domestic sector, and demand that occupancy evaluation is made part of the building regulations, because until people demand it, we won't get it. So I hope that answers the question about whose responsibility is it. The design team need to build it into their fee, and you need to persuade the client that it's a service that should be part of your fee, and the client should pay for it.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that come out of that. One is Chris Jones actually expanded on that, Fionn, because he's saying, had you thought about developing a competency framework for POE specialists, which I'm guessing is, roughly speaking, what this building performance network is hoping to do, and then he's got BS 8670, which I think is about competency in that regard, and then driving more impulse into building regs from that point of view. So is that what the building performance network is hoping to do?
Very much so. Yeah, I mean, I can tell you
there's an aspect of lobbying there that you're trying to do. If you
huge. It's all underway. The good news here.
Right, okay.
I mean, I am sounding impatient, but there is some good news. So I can tell you that there's currently a British standard being developed, which the Building Performance Network has lobbied for, and there's a BS standard being developed. I think the number is 4140101, I think. And there is an advisory panel working through that as we speak. And they're making good progress on that. They're hoping to try and get that BS out by the end of the year, if not earlier. And obviously the strategy there is one reason why the government is able to wriggle out of its obligation to demand, as part of the building regulations, that occupancy evaluation is included alongside air tightness testing and all the rest, is that it doesn't have a proper BS to refer to. I mean, there are a number of British standards that all touch on occupancy evaluation in different ways, but there isn't a single comprehensive building performance evaluation standard. So that's exactly what the Building Performance Network realized a few years ago, and it took them 2 years to get this into place, but it is now underway. So we're hoping once that BS comes out, then the government really will have absolutely no hiding place in terms of its obligation. I mean, interestingly enough, just for your listeners, if you go to that consultation, it is quite interesting because in the non-domestic sector, as a result of the Grenfell disaster, and also as a result of work that's been done on indoor air quality, there is a bit in that consultation that is now looking to non-domestic buildings being monitored for indoor air quality. And that is a huge move from the government, because that we've constantly been told by MHCLG that they're not willing for the building regulations to go beyond the completion stage. They already do, of course, 30 days beyond the completion stage with air tightness testing and whatnot. But, you know, they are really stepping out here, because now they're saying that actually by 2025, you know, they want the building industry to be able to build in indoor air quality monitoring. So that's an interesting one to look out for.
Okay, yeah, I mean, that's great to hear that there's stuff, you know, happening this year rather than the middle of the decade. That's great that not a lot of people would be aware of that. So that's...
Sorry, Doug, I realised I didn't answer the question about competency. So that's the British standard, and that's part of the competency. But in terms of the training, there is, I mean, Wood Knowledge Wales are already doing some BPE training. And certainly the BPN has already held a number of events which have acted as BPE training. Good Homes Alliance is also doing BPE training. So there are a number of organisations doing the BPE training, but what we haven't got, which is where the question is so good, we have not got a validated training programme, and we need that. We did have a training validation for those of us that became building performance evaluators for BEIS. I think about 15 or 20 of us have done this, where we were all evaluated for our competency by the government. But that, you know, that was not a validated training. That was an internal assessment. So yeah, we need it. We need it.
So just kind of swinging away from kind of building regulations, Rachel Owens has asked about, let's think about the kind of the practices now. I mean, we've got to make sure that the practices understand what the benefits are before they talk to their clients about it and beyond. And Rachel's raised a really valid point here, which is talking about, much like many architects, I think they're tentatively thinking about doing post-occupancy evaluation. They see the benefits, but they're looking at risk assessment. So how do you deal with issues such as reporting potentially negative
I love this question
on the project that you've done, and she's mentioned obviously PI insurance. Does that does that have
this is great. This is such a win-win area. So again, if you read my book, the reason why it's interesting is because I put 20 years of know-how into that book. So I basically, you know, spilled the crown jewels and just told everybody this is how I managed to do over 100 POE projects, and how I'm still on very good first name terms with all the private housing developers I've worked with, all the RSLs and everybody else. And, you know, the short answer is you can have a double reporting process. And this is actually what architects did when they did their schools, because they were very nervous back in 2009 when myself and others at Oxford Brookes introduced Archetype to POE through a 2-year knowledge transfer partnership. You know, we helped them along and nursed them into this process. And they were equally terrified. They said, my God, you know, we've got 6 schools out there. We're terrified if we work with the client, you know, if anything comes out, they're going to blame us, PIE and all the rest. The good news is architects have had no litigation whatsoever, even though major issues were discovered in their schools. And in fact, Archetype have gone on to win the Sterling Prize, as most folk will know. And they now have an incredibly robust POE cycle where they do POE on all their buildings, and that's why their practice works. So to come back to the risk issue and the PI, Bren Insurance is the RIBA PI insurance company, and they are very happy for you to do POE, providing you tell them in advance, because they understand that POE actually de-risks buildings. I would say it is an issue for the wider industry, and it's something we're working on with the RIBA. You know, we are meeting with the PI Insurance Association and, you know, working this through with them to show them that actually it's in their interest to have POE, because it will actually reduce the risk and reduce the cost to them in terms of payouts. But I mean, really, this is a reassurance exercise. So for Archetype, for myself, what you do is you tell the bad news to the client. You agree to work on a no-blame basis, and this is where partnership contracts, again, remember I talked about how you have to set things up strategically. So I would really encourage people to use partnership contracts, which work much better than design and build or standard JTC contracts. With a partnership contract like they used on the Olympics, like they've used in many projects now, you're all in it together. A problem shared is a problem solved. And that's exactly what happened with Archetype. There were issues with the school. There were overheating and ventilation issues. There were a lot of commissioning problems, a lot of other things. But, you know, they fessed up to the client privately. They said, we've got to solve this together. You know, they were able to demonstrate that they'd done, you know, they could put their hands on their heart and show that they'd done the best they could, but they just weren't aware of these issues. And the client, the contractor, and the design team all solved it together within the, what's it called? Defects liability period. That's why it's always really important to try and do your POE studies within the defects liability period. So yeah, so you can do this kind of internal working with your design team and the client, and it's all, you know, it's all kept under wraps. And then you can produce a public report. This is something I did with Stuart Milne on the Sigma home down at the BRE Innovation Park years ago. We had a public 9-page report and we had a private 150-page report. And that helped Stuart Milne to redevelop its product, launched a brand new product on the back of the POE, solved a lot of problems. People like Crest Nicholson have done the same, Barrett's have done the same. But in each case, there was a private and a public report. So that's one way of handling that issue. You need to explain to your client and your contractor and your design team that you're working together on this, you're going to solve this together internally, that you will eventually produce some results for public consumption, but you know, that doesn't have to be warts and all. And that only has to come out once you've solved the problems or settled the issue. But I would again urge you guys to read Judith and Sophie's Energy People Buildings book, because they turn this whole thing on its head. They have what's called a risk register. And the risk register is basically the POE process. And it's about, at every stage of the design, well, it's more like a soft landings process, if some of you have heard of soft landings. Soft landings is where POE is built in, but every single stage of the project is monitored to ensure that things are going okay. So if you think about a kind of soft landings process where you're checking at each stage of the project from the inception through to completion and beyond, if you then plug in this risk register that just reminds you what to look out for at every stage, the kind of key typical occupancy issues that will arise unless you sort them at the design stage or the contract stage, you're constantly de-risking your project, so that by the time you get to the post-occupancy, you know, that risk register has already sorted out a lot of issues. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point, actually, Phil, and I think that answers Rachel's question, hopefully. But the de-risking of projects, you know, it's obvious when things change in a process, people think, what's the risk? You know, obviously we immediately swing to the negatives, but there are a huge amount of positives, and this picks up on a thread, a major thread of a presentation that I did a couple of weeks ago on the improved RIBA 2030 design process, and just the way that the design process is changing in general. So rather than this kind of linear, one person passes it on to somebody else, passes it on to somebody else, very much this kind of collaborative, cyclical kind of hub and spoke.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, collaboration's where it's at. And I mean, I'd also say that, you know, in terms of thinking ahead, the RIBA are about to publish another key document that I've been involved with, which is called the Plan for Use. And that's coming out at the end of the month. And that's all, again, about how to build in occupancy evaluation as normal. I mean, to give you some good news stories about why POE is so wonderful. you know, if I go back to the case study that I did, that I showed you, that retrofit study, I mean, I could talk for days about what came out of that study. But one of the most positive things that came out of it for the developer was that as a result of that POE, it greatly empowered the inhabitants. The inhabitants got to know each other. They developed their own Facebook group for the block. And they actually discovered that they had a shared set of skills amongst the inhabitants, including engineers, including electricians, including people who understood mechanical ventilation. And amazingly, this inhabitant group of 200 empowered themselves to solve a lot of their problems. And so several things happened at once. You know, first of all, the building performance improved through inhabitant intervention. Simple things like closing the curtains during the day whilst they were out at work drastically reduced the temperatures in the living rooms, so that when they came home, you know, it wasn't 35. It went, you know, back down more to something like 28. So there were lots of interventions like that. And because the inhabitants were happier, that saved the management developer, because, you know, quite a lot of these homes were rented as well as sold. You know, that saved them a load of money and also got them good publicity. So the other interesting thing is POE findings can give you kudos. They can give your practice kudos, because you can walk out there tall and proud and say, you know what, we walk our talk. You know, as a client, you know, you can pitch to a client. This is why Archetype has done so well. You can pitch to a client and say, look, we have a bulletproof process. We de-risk our buildings. We look at what we do and we learn from what we do. And, you know, you can sell them good news stories about how the whole building performance evaluation process actually empowered the people living in the building, helped them to understand more how their homes worked, built up a really good relationship between the client and the design team, and repeat business. So there's just lots of, you know, good news. It's not all about bad news. You know, POE can discover that your building is brilliant and everybody loves it. And, you know, you have that validated. POE can tell you that your building is performing within its, you know, design intentions. So, you know, we, as Doug says, we tend to hear the bad news stories, but for every bad news story from a post-occupancy evaluation, there's at least 2 good news stories. You know, whether it's the inhabitants or the actual building itself that's working well.
Yeah, I mean, that validation is so key. I mean, even though there are a lot of practices doing some great stuff, there's still a lot of talking. And when it comes to the doing part, very, very, very few practices, even if they've done some incredible sustainable projects, don't have the data to back that up. And, you know, and a client can't argue with that. And then there's so many learning opportunities there. I would definitely, you know, mirror what Fion's saying there. One thing I would pick up on, actually, that I wrote here when you were talking about the very early stages, building in POE from the very, very, very earliest stages of a project, we for a long time have advocated trying to better understand what success of a building is to the client. And my view, or our view, is that the project is only successful if the client thinks it's successful. It doesn't matter if the architect thinks it's successful, or the structural engineer, or all these various other things, because the client's got to live in this building, particularly when it comes to homes and the occupants. So being able to understand what kind of health and well-being aspirations.
I would agree with that to a point, Doug, but I would also question that in terms of ethics. So I know that there are 2 schools of thought within building performance evaluation. So there's one school of thought that says you should make your building performance evaluation bespoke to your client. That's one school of thought. Then there's another school of thought that says, no, actually, ethically, there are absolute standards that go beyond the client. And those are obviously health and safety standards, comfort standards, climate emergency standards in terms of carbon emissions, energy use. So, you know, I'd go further than it's, you know, what the client wants. Yes, of course, it's what the clients want. You know, we as architects have to do what the client wants, but we mustn't become prostitutes. You know, we mustn't just say, well, you know, whatever the clients want, that's good. Because, you know, that's why the RIBA had an ethics commission, And that ethics commission was very, very clear, you know, that we have a duty of care as professionals, and that duty of care is beyond the client. We have a duty of care to the bigger place we're living in that we call our home, that is currently destroying itself. Well, it's not destroying itself. We as a cancer on it are destroying it. You know, that's the climate emergency. So we have a bigger duty of care. And that is where BPE can actually be used as a tool to actually gently question your client's brief, or gently question what your client is doing in a very constructive way that can actually work as a win-win for you and the client. So I would agree with you that it's important that the building performance evaluation process meshes, to use your lovely phrase, you know, meshes with the client. Sure. But at the same time, you sometimes have to think beyond the meshwork, you know, beyond the network, and think, well, what's the bigger picture here? And that's where, you know, building performance evaluation should use absolute benchmarks. So it's where I think, for example, measuring kilowatt hours per meter squared per year is actually pretty useless. And that might sound contentious, but I think it is, because that does nothing to solve the fact that the absolute energy use is what is really important with a building. So you may be hitting a passive house standard of 15 kilowatt hours per meter squared for your heating. But frankly, if you've got a home that is 350 meters squared, that's a lot of energy. Whereas if you had a home that was only 100 square meters, you would be using a lot less energy. Yeah. So my argument with building performance metrics is that we need to move beyond the current accepted metrics of kilowatt hours per meter squared, and we need to move to total energy use. We also need to look at occupancy metrics, because the other thing is, if you've got a 350 meter square home, and there are plenty of these around with passive house, and they're only occupied by 1 or 2 people, that is criminal. You know, in terms of the planet, that is, you know, that is a home that should preferably have 4, maybe 6 people in it. So I think we need to look at metrics related to occupancy levels. I mean, also over occupancy is a huge issue. So when it comes to social housing, you know, particularly refugee housing, we often see people sharing beds. A home that's designed for 4 people is actually being lived in by 8 people. And this is not being recorded. So, you know, building performance evaluation can be really helpful in terms of wider social issues, looking at under and over occupancy, and also looking at absolute energy use. So it can be used to gently, you know, gently work with the client to look at these bigger issues as well.
Great. Right. Okay, Fionn, plenty of food for thought there. A great discussion session after your presentation there. I've put as many links as I can do for these books, including your one and the one by Judith Hattie and Sophie on the chat box there. So if you guys want to follow those, as I say, we'll put this recording up on YouTube. So by the end of the day. So if you've forgotten the bulk of what you've heard, you can go and remember to listen to the interesting bits again. That's been great, Fionn. Really appreciate that, and hopefully everybody on the call has at least learned something there. As I say, I would certainly encourage you to do something. Do something. You haven't got.
Yeah, that's a good note to end on.
Just do something. It doesn't have to be mega complicated.
No.
Just by way of a kind of a final reminder for next week's webinar, David Reed is doing a masterclass on solar PV. So if you're interested in all things to do with solar PV, David's your man as usual. So book on Eventbrite, drop onto that one, and we look forward to seeing you there. So for now, guys, thank you very much. Again, a final huge thank you to Fionn, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.
Thank you, Doug. Thanks very much, everyone.
No worries.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.